And to help us understand the challenges faced particularly by women in conflict situations is political scientist Professor Mojúbàolú Olufúnké Okome of Brooklyn College, City University of New York in the USA. A very good evening to you, and thank you really for taking the time to speak to us. Much appreciated. So let's talk about how we should be framing the circumstances faced by women and children, particularly girl children, in the face of conflict. And I'm just wondering if contemporary literature has moved on dealing with the political, social and economic reconstruction for women in conflict.
I think the balance of the evidence shows that although there are gender-specific ways in which women experience more trauma and dislocation of their lives, that the emphasis is still on men because of the way in which the patriarchal structures that we have tend to center men and their experiences in policy making, in decision making, and in determination of where resources should be targeted. So there's considerable evidence of this. And what is really disturbing is that when wars occur, I mean, you can have situations where the fatalities that happen are predominantly among men. But women are the larger percentage, overwhelmingly larger percentage of people who are displaced. About 75% of refugees tend to be women and displaced persons as well. And then children that women have responsibility for. So given the fact that humanitarian responses are seen as necessary, it is actually just counterintuitive that the people who are the majority in terms of who needs the services are ignored. But it's, thanks to organizations like UN Women, even the World Bank and the IMF have done research that show that there's a need to prioritize women and children's needs and also involve them in decision-making about peace building in all its ramifications.
So I'm just curious, what evidence is there that women are being included in peace building initiatives, but particularly in conflict resolution? Are they given a voice, or is their voice being heard at all?
There's a lot of aspiration, there's a lot of rhetoric, there's a lot of intention. There's no actual manifestation of this aspiration in terms of the level of inclusiveness of women and of them at the level of expertise, and also at the level of the people who have actually endured a lot of this trauma and have knowledge about their needs and what the priorities ought to be. So aspirations are plentiful, but actual involvement and inclusion and respect for the perspectives that women bring, that is almost non-existent.
So I want us to be anecdotal in what we're talking about, just so that we use practical examples occurring now. As we mentioned, the situation in the Ukraine, the world has been looking at what's been going on there. African women, even though African peoples in general, but people of color that have been discriminated against from accessing transportation or a means to flee the conflict. So how can we better understand or facilitate the mobilization of women? And by that I mean translating their individual grievances as a group into legitimate social concerns.
All right. I was so privileged to meet Lima Gbowe, the Nobel Peace Laureate, who actually has some students that she sponsored for education in the Ukraine stuck there. And she had to, actually she might be on her way to Ukraine now. She was able to use personal networks that she has to facilitate rescue. I think one of the most disturbing things about this conflict is to see the ways in which the intersection of race, gender, and national origin is working against Africans who are in the war zone, who need the same level of consideration, rescue, humanity. They have humanitarian needs that need to be served. And even some of the news coverage is equally disturbing, because you have people saying that, this is in Ukraine and it's Europe, it's not Africa, it's not Afghanistan, it's not Syria. We don't expect this kind of thing to happen here. So there's a mindset that is still white supremacist in terms of the way in which we manage resources in our world, in terms of decisions that we make. When people have administrative initiative that allows them to decide who gets let in, who gets left out, who gets pulled off a bus. And it's very distressing to me that, African students, a lot of them are students, but there are others who are there in Ukraine, are being treated as second-class citizens in this really tragic situation that has evolved. Everybody is human. And I think it is about time in this world where we get equity and, the understanding that whatever consideration is available to those traumatized by the war in Ukraine, who are Ukrainians, actually there must be also Black Ukrainians, I'm sure, or maybe Ukrainians, with, double citizenship from other places. Whatever consideration is available to the white population should be available to the Black people there too. And I also think that African governments should have been more proactive in rescuing citizens from their countries from these situations. I'm glad some countries have stepped in and they're doing that, but they left it too late. So I think that in the 21st century, given all the rhetoric we have about human rights, about equality, about justice, about equity, there is no space whatsoever for the kind of treatment that one sees documented through media reports of Africans in Ukraine, which is different from the way in which white Ukrainians are being treated.
So
and if you look at Syria, okay.
No, go ahead.
So if you look at Syria and you look at Afghanistan and you look at other places in the world, even African countries that are in conflict, the response is not the same in terms of what the powerful countries decide to do, who they decide to recognize as refugees, whether or not they are opening their borders or closing those borders against people who are fleeing from conflict, So you can see a stark, I don't see any reason why we should not condemn Putin and Russia for invading Ukraine, in the strongest terms. But these are the same kinds of responses that are deserving in all these other situations. Ethiopia also comes to mind.
Okay, so we'll get to Ethiopia, but I just want to understand from your perspective. So let's transplant some of the questions that you are asking to Nigeria, for instance. And I want to understand the difference in the conflicts and the manner in which things are dealt with. There was this big international campaign of Save Our Girls when it came to the Chibok girls, they're being abducted and the atrocities that they faced. It almost became like a pet project And I say that because it seems to have lost the allure of those who were talking about the insecurity faced by young girls and women in Nigeria within the conflict of this banditry phenomenon that you and I have spoken about. So what makes it so different if we're talking about human rights, if we're talking about accountability, and at state level, and actors who should be engaging the state on this?
Well, it's going to be 8 years on April 14 since the Chibok girls were abducted. I think in focusing on the Chibok girls, we also forget that there are thousands of women and girls who have been similarly abducted, whose names we don't know. Unfortunately, the mainstream media and majority of people in the world, they have short attention spans. I think fortunately, there's still some of us, including myself, who are determined to keep agitating and pushing the Nigerian government to rescue these girls. 112 of them, of those Chibok girls, are still being held by Boko Haram. They're also, Nigeria has also been plagued recently by all these kidnappings by people that they call bandits. So you have a lot of children from schools being held by people either for ransom or they have abducted them and they're nowhere to be found. There are humanitarian workers who are women who have also been abducted. Actually, 2 of them were killed on video, and that video was transmitted via YouTube and other sources. So one of the things that has become my own number one agenda point is until these girls and women are rescued, then the Nigerian government should not be allowed to have any moment of peace. It is the responsibility of the state to ensure that there's security in the persons of all the citizens. And also that when citizens are then, when violence, including kidnapping and abduction, is inflicted on citizens, a state must get into high gear and rescue them. So it's the responsibility of the Nigerian state to do this. And this is what Bring Back Our Girls is all about. Okay. And there are still people fighting for this, even though the media is not covering it. So one of the things that's disappointing about what we choose to focus on is that we have this hierarchy, it seems, about whose lives are important. And the lives of poor girls from a remote community in Nigeria doesn't seem to be as valuable as other lives whose stories are told. But then it is the responsibility of citizens to demand from governments that are in control over the territory in which they live, that they must live up to their responsibility of rescue and rehabilitation, and also that psychosocial care must be given to these people who have been traumatized.
Because we are running out of time, I need to ask this final question in terms of the strategies that women can develop to cope with war-induced changes and the economic environment, and what global systems can do to support them. Because I feel like there seems to be an acceptance that some women are perpetually destined to die in war. If we look at what women in the DRC have been suffering, Palestinian women, you mentioned Yemeni women, you speak now about Ethiopia. Some things are commonly known that rape is a weapon of war. Why do these practices persist, and what can global systems do in acknowledging the cost to the global economy of women and children being trapped and excluded from economic development?
It's about whose lives we value. And as I said before, we live in a gendered world. So decisions that are made tend to privilege those who are seen as deserving, as, being of value in the system that we're in. It tends to be predominantly men. It tends to be predominantly white. And then there's this assumption that conflict and chaos and displacement is a normal situation in some parts of the world. You've heard that in recent media reports and analysis. And this is a wrong sort of approach, because it contradicts everything that the international community has even signed on to when it comes to human rights, the human rights agenda. The Security Council passed a Women, Peace and Conflict resolution where rape as an instrument of war has been declared illegal. So there needs to be, we need to go beyond talk and show that we're serious about this. So legal processes to prosecute people who have inflicted rape as instruments of war, they need to be fast-tracked. They need to be prioritized. There's also need for material resources, for people who are in these situations. If you look at many of the displaced people, girls and children, they don't have schools, they don't have enough food, there's extortion of food for sex. So if we're going to involve these women, you will see that in talks about, either peacemaking or peace building, where communities are reconstructed, they will be front and center. I think some very encouraging examples are the ways in which Liberian women, under the leadership of people like Lima Gbowe, took charge, occupied spaces that men were controlling and said, we're not going to leave until there is peace. So these are some of the things women can do. But women tend to kind of be nimble. They tend to be resilient. They tend to just do everything they can, including sometimes submitting to sexual exploitation in order to get care for their families.
Yes,
but this ought not to be where we are.
It's such a pity that we have run out of time. It sounds like an extensive conversation that we need to have, and I hear you're very passionate about it. I appreciate your time and your insights, particularly on this matter. Professor Mojúbàolú Olufúnké Okome, she is a political scientist professor of Brooklyn College, City University of New York in the USA, speaking to us about women in conflict, the causes and some of the solutions. Thank you very much for your time.